issues around safe routes by asking the people who've crossed the channel what those safe routes would have looked like and what they've tried before. So it's not just a case of an organisation presenting what it thinks it knows around policy and what would work, but actually asking those people who've had to live that journey and that experience. But it's not about MRN, and it's definitely about the speakers and about the issue tonight. So again, thank you for joining us. I want to thank Sophie, Joe and Clare for organising it and, you know, sorting out all the technical difficulties as well. So I really appreciate that. This is a safe space, so please be appreciative that there will be people with lived experience that are joining us tonight. If you are going to make any abusive or derogatory comments, then sadly we will be asking you to exit, because we do want this to be a safe space. We do want discussion and dialogue, but we want it to be respectful. Naturally, in terms of the content and the conversation tonight, there's actually so much that we could talk about, but obviously we're going to focus in on asylum accommodation. But just to give you the context of where that asylum accommodation conversation is happening, we've had the kind of laying down of the illegal migration bill, their language, not language that we would use. It's very inhumane. It's an assault on refugee and asylum rights. And there are many clauses in it that are going to be incredibly problematic, to say the least, and hopefully will be challenged to the hilt in the courts if it gets passed, which sadly I think it may. Parts of the bill, so there's a legal duty now that will be placed on the Home Secretary to remove, as soon as reasonably practical, anyone who comes to the UK on a boat or via any clandestine means. So that's not just looking at small boats, it's looking at anyone who arrives that's not coming through an authorised government scheme. And that individual will be either detained firstly, so there's going to be a mass detention angle to this, but then they will be rapidly deported to either the home country, to a third safe country, or to Rwanda if that policy goes ahead. And hopefully we know that that's back in the courts as well. So fingers crossed that will be one thing that gets ticked off. Modern slavery claims threshold is going to be changed as well. So again, if you're being trafficked here, they're not going to really see you as a trafficking victim. It's going to be about detaining and deporting you. So they're not thinking about people who may be victims in this, in terms of they've had no choice in terms of how they've got to the UK. And there's going to be other aspects which again we have no details on, new routes, so they're called safe and legal routes, although it would just be safe routes, but there's going to be caps on those. So, but the main issue here is around how asylum accommodation is currently an issue, but also how it will be a bigger issue in the near future if this bill passes. And just basically the detention angle that will kind of come as the bill is implemented. So with that in mind, I'd like to invite Julia Savage, who's the campaigns manager for Asylum Matters. She works in the Northwest specifically, and Julia is kind of going to set the scene on the evolution of asylum accommodation and now what it's...
Go out and try and come back in.
Sorry, if you are unmuted, it'd be great if you could just mute yourselves. And she's going to also talk about this planned expansion of containment, which is now emerging through the new bill. So I'm going to hand you over to Julia. You can have about 10 minutes to speak. So thank you.
Super, thanks ever so much. And hello, everyone. It's lovely to see you all. I've been asked, as was just said, to talk a little bit about the evolution of accommodation for people seeking safety in the UK and about containment. That's the story, really. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a move from community-based provision to containment. That's what we're seeing, and that's certainly what's in this bill. But I'd like to start just really quickly by zooming out a little bit, because I think it is really important to remember kind of where we've come from and think back to a time. Actually, I wasn't working in this field at that time, but I understand that pre-1993, which is kind of 20 years ago, it's not that long ago, the situation was such that people's immigration status had actually very little bearing on their access to kind of mainstream welfare provision. So things like income support and housing benefit. There was a time when that was the case. Successive pieces of legislation have curtailed that over the last 20 years, and the major development which has set the scene for the last years of housing in the UK was, of course, in 1999 when the Labour government introduced asylum dispersal. And what dispersal effectively did, I'm going to talk about it a little bit before we get to where we are now, because I think it's important to contextualise in how the kind of movement away from communities and into sort of containment is taking place. One of the things that asylum dispersal did when it was brought in was effectively set up a separate system of housing, if you like, run by the Home Office, and the dispersal of people seeking asylum in the UK controlled by the Home Office at that time, as I understand it, to move people primarily out of South East England to other parts of the country. Now, that system has been governed by contracts, contracted with private providers, and we are on our second iteration of those contracts now, and they're called the Asylum, Accommodation and Support contracts. They run from, they were signed in 2019, and they're due to run until 2029. They're worth about £4.5 billion over those 10 years. And I'm sure many of you will be aware that they are contracted out to 3 companies, Serco, Mears, and a company called Clear Springs Ready Homes. And those companies operate in different parts of the country in terms of procurement of housing. Important also to say, of course, that asylum accommodation is currently only provided to people who would otherwise be destitute and is on a no choice basis. So people have got absolutely no choice over where they live. Just a few very quick comments on those contracts before I move on. I think it's fair to say that our assessment is that the contractual regime is very fragile, it's very prone to disruption. Many of you, I'm sure, will be of widespread reports of substandard provision under that regime, very opaque in terms of transparency, and there really isn't much, and accountability, there really isn't much at all. I would say no, near zero in terms of public accountability, really, for how, well, accountability near zero, I would say. And certainly, I also think it's fair to say that particularly in the recent use of hotels, which I'll get onto in a second, consultation over how asylum dispersal works with local communities and local authorities has been starkly absent. Nonetheless, people have, and this is what we've got to hang on to, and this is what I really want to stress tonight, I suppose, people have been housed in communities as an integral part of communities. So in flats and in shared houses, in streets, in communities, the same as we all are, and that's how it should stay. And that is what is now under threat and is now changing. Obviously, we have seen widespread hotel use, or we are seeing widespread hotel use at the moment. That's happened before, in the sense that with these contracts in periods of transition, we have seen the use of hotels before, and all the problems that are associated with hotels and the use of hotels and the loss of autonomy that happens to people when they're living in unsuitable hotel accommodation, such as difficulty accessing healthcare, widespread terrible food provision, multiple moves without notice, lack of ability to access education and advice, and so on. But all the things we're seeing now, we've seen before, and the government has seen before. And the thing that has changed now is that we're looking at a completely different scale, I think, and that is basically because, my assessment certainly is that is basically because the Home Office decision-making function collapsed and went into freefall over the COVID pandemic. So at the end of 2021, I think the decision-making backlog in the Home Office was something around 80,000. Now it's over 160,000, I think. And what that means is that people are stuck in limbo for ever longer, and hotel use is more widespread, more visible, and obviously more controversial. So that's where we are kind of now. That's where we kind of got to, and the reaction of the government in reaction to that, if you like, or as a kind of their reaction to it, has been to move ever more drastically towards containment. That's what they're doing, and the kind of this bill is I think the kind of, I mean, you couldn't get more sweeping in terms of what is proposed in it, as I understand. Many of you'll know that from 2020 already, the government started to look at ex-military facilities in which to place people seeking asylum. These facilities obviously are, hotels are utterly unsuitable. These facilities are utterly unsuitable, re-traumatizing, and share many of the features of detention in terms of what they do to people. Government has successfully installed ex-military sites at Napier Barracks in Folkestone, which is unfortunately still open. They successfully opened a site in Penally in Pembrokeshire, which is now closed. They tried and importantly failed, and I'll talk about this a bit more, to open sites in Barton Stacey in Hampshire, in the shadow of Yarlswood Immigration Removal Centre, from April last year in a place called Linton-on-Ouse in North Yorkshire on an RAF base. Since then, we have had a kind of a scandal of large-scale and lawful detention in the processing centre at Manston. And in the last weeks, kind of coinciding with this bill, we have started to see press about potential new centres at a place called MDP Wethersfield in Essex and RAF Scampton in Lincolnshire. I think we should be under no illusions that, I mean, we don't know what we're facing because the government has made no announcement, as far as I'm aware, in relation to those sites. But I think we should be under no illusions that what we may be facing there is kind of complete containment. I don't think it's possible to really overstate the amount of harm that's done by these facilities to people. I'm not even going to try, because others are going to do that tonight and they're going to do it better than me. All I'm going to say is that it wreaks havoc. What I do kind of, a point I do want to make is that not only do these facilities cause real harm to the people who are placed in them, they also inflict damage in the communities in which they're placed. So I think we've seen kind of extensive efforts when trying to stand up the sites that I've been talking about. I think it's fair to say that there have been efforts to kind of avoid planning and scrutiny, in that normal planning processes haven't been followed. So one example of that would be that in Napier Barracks, planning permission to continue that site was given 4 or 5 years by an incredibly unusual procedure of using delegated legislation to continue the use of that site without meaningful public consultation, or any public consultation, in fact, until after the fact, and so that, you know, arguably is not meaningful. At somewhere like Linton-on-Ouse, and this is a pattern which I think people can recognise across the country, but in Linton-on-Ouse, the first anybody, as far as I'm aware, the first anybody knew of the site locally, and by that I mean residents, police, health services, the local councils, was when they heard an announcement from Priti Patel in the wake of the announcement on Rwanda. And I suppose it's worth saying also that where particularly the ex-military sites have been proposed, they're very often in small communities with limited infrastructure. Thanks, I'll close. And so residents there have had to contend with being plunged into the middle of a very contested area of debate, with a lack of transparency, and with effectively also agitation by racist groups in their communities. I want to end, I've got to end. I want to end by saying I think it's really important to remember, like, as we gear up to fight this bill, as it goes through Parliament and beyond, that in the vast majority of these places where these sites have been mooted, they haven't opened, and they haven't opened because of really brilliant, effective, locally run campaigns by people that live in those communities, coupled with kind of the threat of legal action against the government. So I think we need to take heart from that, and also take heart from the fact that we have a really strong counter argument about how you know, for the last 20 years, people have been housed in communities in the UK. There's absolutely no reason why that shouldn't continue if the resources of the government and the energy of government is put into like resourcing communities and not camps. I'll leave it there. I think that's probably my time up. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was really helpful to have that kind of overview. And I think also just highlighting that this isn't just this government's that's involved and complicit in this, but actually successive governments, including Labour, and particularly in terms of the contracting out, which seems to have just amplified, sadly, to the point where we haven't really touched upon it. I'm not sure if we will, but obviously just trigger warning, there have been deaths in asylum accommodation as well, you know, which is really problematic in terms of, again, like the trauma that people are facing, and then they're in these accommodations without that support or without those connections. So I am now going to hand over to Graham, who's just going to Graham O'Neill, who's the policy manager of Scottish Refugee Council, and he's going to talk about the types of accommodation and that basically making asylum seekers much more invisible, as well as eroding their human rights. And yeah, we'll look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks very much, and yeah, thanks to everyone at MSF as well for inviting us to come along tonight. And it's lovely to see some familiar faces, and for those that it's first time meeting, hopefully I can do this important subject justice. Yeah, so as Fizza says, I'm Graham O'Neill. I'm policy manager at Scottish Refugee Council as far as kind of job titles go. In practice, like I'm a campaigner. I work as best I can for human rights and anti-racism, and the extreme racialisation of the asylum process should just be said, and that's why I'm trying to say it just now, because I think it helps it certainly helps me in terms of understanding what's going on here, as a pretty voracious and horrendous form of racism, along many forms. All racism is bad, but there's something really, really quite egregious happening, and has been happening. Well, I've been in the sector for about 10 years, but for at least over a generation, as Julia says, 20 years, and as Fizza says, like successive governments have been doing it. I suppose the first thing I wanted to say was similar to what Julia was talking about in terms of trying to stand back from what's happening currently with the bill. Is it kind of like maybe the most extreme manifestation of this racism? Is that, I mean, for about at least 15 years, we've had this kind of like deliberate erosion, sometimes gradual, sometimes accelerating erosion in human rights protection for people who are coming here seeking safety. And one of the clearest places that's been happening is in what the Home Office call asylum accommodation, what we call, or try as much as we can to call, the public service of housing to people seeking refugee protection, people seeking safety. And that erosion, I think, became quite deep-seated when the first contracts the first commercial contracts were kind of like longer-term commercial contracts. You know, the acronym was Compass contracts in 2012 through to 2019. And my sense at the start of those contracts is that you had people routinely in community-based accommodation and often in social housing, as opposed to what happened later on during the life of those contracts as austerity was kicking in and hurting communities, particularly communities that already were dealing with multiple forms of poverty, like where I am today in Glasgow is one of those communities, northwest of England, northeast of England, West Midlands, South Wales. these were all the places of deep, entrenched multiple deprivation, where the Home Office and its contractors, its commercial contractors, were putting people into. And of course, that was, kind of like concentrations of people into areas that were already struggling significantly. It was working class communities, not middle class or posh communities that people were being moved into. And sometimes in Glasgow, we found the welcome really strong, as often as we working class communities, but other times there was real tensions and feelings of insecurity and precarity in people's lives, both people in the asylum process and outside of the asylum process. But nobody really had the backs within the public sector of people in the asylum process. That's one of the first other things I wanted to say here, is what is really noticeable to me is it's charities and communities that have the backs of people in the asylum process. And there's been this steady erosion and withdrawal of the UK state, and also at times local authorities too, which is maybe more understandable because they're getting hammered by austerity, but actually having the backs of asylum seekers, and that matters, I think, because what you see is a system, the Home Office system, which doesn't take human rights protection seriously, kind of uses and abuses that term safeguarding and kind of contorts it in practice. There is no safeguarding, I think, worthy of the name within the asylum process. But then nobody else is there really, apart from communities and NGOs and charities, to have the backs of people who are already carrying huge trauma within their lives. So I suppose in terms of housing, it's so pivotal, isn't it, to people to be able to feel any sort of sense of peace of mind and safety in their lives. And too often, and more, I think it's now the norm, housing, asylum accommodation, as the government call it, was actually becoming a real source of trauma for people in their lives. So you had, as Julia mentioned, it's persistently low standard accommodation. And I think one of the reasons that was happening is this is a commercial contract. And as we moved through the contract through the 2010s, what we saw is these big shifts from people moving from social housing into cheap-end private housing in areas of entrenched multiple deprivation, housing that hadn't been invested in for ages, kind of built in damp to the walls, real lack of kind of proper work in the guttering, dodgy electrical wires. No accident that, these were the cheaper end of the private rented sector, and that's where people were obviously being put, mainly because this was a commercial contract. So what we were also starting to see is this kind of like development of this really entrenched parallel public service of housing to people seeking asylum safety within these communities. So local authorities either been shut out, local services either been shut out of the process, and I think it's it was more convenient for them to look away. But partly because of the austerity stuff, partly because they were they just didn't want to go there. They said, this isn't us, this is private housing, this is a Home Office, that's their responsibility. So going back to that thing, nobody's really got the backs of the people who are in the system themselves. And often, with some great examples in Glasgow, where the people, as very resilient individuals and communities, organise themselves. Like Refugees for Justice are a really amazing example of that in Glasgow after the Park Inn incident. It's just like, we'll speak for ourselves. We know what this system's doing to us, and we'll take ownership. And they're absolutely stunningly, amazing group, as some of you, I'm sure, will know. And if you don't, please read the report that Helena Kennedy, commissioned by Refugees for Justice, done into the Park Inn tragedy in Glasgow in June 2020. But then I suppose as we move through from this shift from social to private accommodation, then what we also start to see was this parallel public service taking hold, which was separating out people in the asylum process from local communities much more than was hitherto the case. And then I think also we started to see this real shift before COVID, so from mid to late 2019, to what I would now say is a kind of hyper-institutionalisation, hyper-commercialisation of the housing arrangements, or more so now the quasi-detention arrangements for people coming here seeking safety. And I mean, in terms of the figures, they speak for themselves, and the money speaks for itself. That in terms of the shift from institutionalisation, we've got, I think it was in March 2020, 2,500 people. Sorry, October 2019, there was 1,500 people in ex-hotel institutional type accommodation across the UK. We now know that it's over 50,000 people. So COVID's kind of like, in terms of the severest effects of it, are thankfully in the background now, but that's not ever explained to my mind, and not why we had this hyper institutionalisation of accommodation. And that trend is a trend to me, is only going to increase. And in terms of the commercial part to that, it's no accident that that's happening, because the money, the revenues that the free companies are receiving from the Treasury are frightening, unsustainable. So as Julia mentioned, when these contracts were commissioned, it was like £4.5 to £5.5 billion was the Treasury estimate. They're currently likely to run at about £30 to £35 billion. And the volumes are frightening and unsustainable, but what really matters here is the dysfunctional distribution of those monies. Pretty much all of those monies are going from the Treasury, maybe through the Foreign Office or the Home Office, depending on the year of the funding, and then it's going straight to these private companies. None of it goes to local communities, none of it goes to local authorities, none of it certainly goes to refugees who are getting asked to survive on £1.30 a day. Or £6 a day if they're in community-based accommodation. So I just want to emphasise, this isn't any accident. Super chronically slow asylum decision processes are good business for the companies. And I think we just need to hold on to the consideration, whether one agrees fully or not. I respect that people don't fully agree. But the reason that we've got the system we've got in terms of this movement from community-based to institutional accommodations, because it makes lots of money for the companies. And these companies, when you stand back and think about who's actually running the show here, well, it's all outsourced. All the expertise around knowing the housing markets within different areas, doing the deals with the hotels to become institutional accommodation, none of that sits with the Home Office civil servants. It all sits with the companies because it's been outsourced for such a long period of time. So we need to, if we're trying to overcome this, I think our analysis needs to take really seriously how commercially powerful these companies are in terms of the change. And obviously some of the figures that Joe mentioned in the chat, I've noticed, and but just Clear Springs Ready Home are a really good company to give that insight into what's going on here. So from 2018 to 2022, those 5 years, they brought in £39 million of profit. Most of that profit has been in the last 2 years. But then to make it really obscene, there's about £39 million of dividends between 3 directors that was awarded in 2021. That's no accident that that's happening. And going back to the accountability, aside from, the kind of like egregious nature of that profiteering, that, at least I can't say definitively it's profiteering, but what I can say is that some of the conditions may be there for that to be profiteering, or at least the argument that that may be profiteering. Obviously, Clear Springs may disagree with that, but that amount of money is frightening in terms of where it could have been going to benefit local communities and others. So I suppose this kind of like institutionalisation, commercialisation, and this chronic lack of human rights protection and accountability for people have been kind of worsening. And now we've got the bill, and we've got the kind of incarceration regime that we see a lot in the States, I think now starting to play out here with this. And it's the companies that are going to be, the reason I'm emphasising the companies so much, because I think they get lost in a lot of this debate. And I don't want that to be, because it ignores the power, the power they got.
Yeah, it's all right. Thank you. Sorry, just wanted to get the other speakers, and then we can bring that into the discussion as well. I think you're touching on a really important point around the outsourcing a lot of the immigration systems, especially in the asylum system, whether it's outsourcing to us as individuals in terms of as having to check people's immigration status as landlords and employers, but so on. And I'm really glad, again, thank you for bringing out the kind of like the aspect of safety. Really is about safe for who at the moment. People have fled to try and get safety, and then they get here, and the welcome that they receive is anything but what is going to make someone feel safe. So sorry, I'm just sorry to cut you short there, but I hope we can carry on with that in the discussion. So thank you. And please, if you do have questions, do start writing them in the chat. We are going to open it up for discussion. So, we do want it to be kind of, involving everyone who's attending tonight. So next, I want to invite Ronnie Tagwireyi to speak. Thank you very much for joining us, Ronnie. Ronnie is going to share his lived experience of having to, and maybe still, living in Section 4 accommodation, asylum accommodation, but also hopefully bring in his activist hat, which I hear is really big and has been campaigning a lot on this. So really look forward to hearing what you have to say, Ronnie. Thank you.
Thank you, Fizza. Right, hi everyone. Can you hear me well now? Right. Okay. So my name is Ronnie. I'm currently seeking asylum. My initial claim was refused in 2018, and I've appealed that, and I'm still awaiting for progress on that. I've also been, I'm currently in home office accommodation, and I'm supported by the home office. I get a stipend of £45 a week, and I live in accommodation, 2-bedroom flat that I share with a young lad from Egypt currently. But I've also been in immigration detention, and that is where I want to start off. I was in immigration detention in 2015, from August 2015 to November 2015, 3 months. I think the best way I can sort of like talk you through Dungavel is to give you a typical day in Dungavel. So I'll choose a day sort of 3 weeks into my 3-month stay, and I choose a day 3 weeks into my 3-month stay because it takes about 2 weeks to acclimatize, for want of a better word, because before that, everything is just a blur. So I wake up, breakfast is served between 8 and 9. I cross from the residential hall to the dining hall, and on the way there, I'll meet someone crying, and you think, hey, what's going on? Oh, I went to report yesterday, and I was detained. Where were you? In Manchester? Huh? From Manchester? How have you ended up in Scotland? So that's what the immigration system does. They detain you for no reason, and they put you as far away from your family as possible. So this guy, I've just picked up random. He's picked up from, he went to report, and he's been reporting for the last 5 years, but for absolutely no reason, he's detained, and he ends up at Dungavel, and try and tell him things will be all right, and then you have breakfast. After breakfast is then when you do you can work, so sort of like hoovering corridors or cleaning toilets, and you get paid for that £1 a day. So that is what people in Dungavel earn, and everything is done by detainees, but everyone earns just £1 a day. So while you're doing that, your work may be stopped because someone has received his removal directions, and he's been told that he'll be on a flight to, say, Pakistan tomorrow 4 p.m. and he must get ready. So he then kicks off, and then the whole place is under lockdown. So you're then locked down for a couple of hours while they try to sort that matter out. Again, all this is playing on your mind all the time. It's like, when is this going to happen to me? Will this happen to me? And then after that, you go for lunch. And then after lunch, you arrange a game of football. And then the same thing happens again. Someone kicks off, and then or someone is trying to commit suicide, so everyone is again locked up, and then that's a typical day in Dungavel, and that happens all the time, and that happens every day of my 3 months there. Then it's a rush for people to speak to solicitors, it's a last chance saloon for a lot of people. So it's really a mind-numbing place. I hope I never ever have to see that kind of thing again. Big men crying, trying to commit suicide. It's just not a very nice place, Dungavel. And I'll never forget the day, 15th November 2015. I was bailed, and I was bailed out to Glasgow. And since I've been in Glasgow, I've met about 10 to 20 guys that I met in Dungavel. I've met these guys in Glasgow. So basically, that's a lot of people that are in detention that eventually do get bailed. So you wonder why were you detained in the first place? So that's there's nothing at all that's good about detention. It's a waste of time. And the UK, sort of uniquely, I think, in Europe, don't have a time limit on detention. So that's another thing that bothers a lot of people. You don't know when it's going to end, how it's going to end, where it's going to end. So I think that's all I'll say about Dungavel. Anyway, I'm now bailed, and I'm in Glasgow, and I'm in Section 4 accommodation. Section 4 because my my initial asylum claim was refused. So now that I'm appealing it, they give me what they call Section 4, which means the stipend that I get, the money that I get, I can only spend in a supermarket or buy something, but I cannot go to an ATM and withdraw cash. I can only go to the ATM and obviously check the balance on the card, which is the Home Office provide, and they upload £45 a week to that card. So if there's something that I don't, like I need, like from African shops, typically, like the kind of foods that I like, you get them from African shops, and these are independent, small sort of shops. So most of them do not take cards. Not all of them, they don't take cards. So you need cash. But as a person who doesn't get cash, I have to find a way around that. So I go to the local pub. I'll speak to, say, John. I say, John, you having cigarettes this week? And he'll go, yeah. I'll get me 2 packs, Ronnie, but for changing this money for this into cash for you, 2 packs of cigarettes, £10 each. I pay £20 and John gives me £15. So I've already lost £5 of £45. And talking about £5, if I want to go anywhere, bus fares are £5. Sorry, £5 for a day pass in Glasgow. So if I want to go anyways, £45, what's that? About £6 something a day. So it's basically my day allowance if I want to buy a bus pass. So you're really making a choice there. So I have had to miss in the past solicitor appointments, rearrange those because I haven't had the money to go. Doctor's appointments, important things like that. And then, of course, there's socializing. That's a no-no. It doesn't happen. If it's not walking distance, then it's not happening. And then the accommodation itself, I mean, Graham has touched on it, that some of these houses are really horrible, mold infested and all sorts. But mine was, but they have sorted it out now after a couple of years. So, these houses are given on a no choice basis, and you usually share. So I'll tell you, when I first came in, when I came out of Dungavel, I was put into this place with a guy from the Democratic Republic of Congo, never met him before, and he'd been a child soldier, and he had issues, obviously, from growing up and fighting all his life. But the Home Office saw it fit that someone like me could live with him, but he used to sort of like have a knife under his pillow at night. He used to have nightmares and all of that, but I didn't feel safe. And I told this to the Home Office or to the contractor, and they would say things like, precedence, you can't move. Once you're in, you're in. And so I didn't feel safe, but that was made worse by the fact that you cannot have locks on your doors when you're in home office accommodation, because the home office can come in at any time, whether it's to inspect or, you know, for reasons to deport you if they want to take you and detain you. So you cannot lock your door. So because I share with someone, I just have to trust that everything will be, will be okay at night, especially as I gave you this example of someone that actually had issues and really should have been accommodated on his own or, in a special facility. Yeah, that's the accommodation. It's not really good, and I report to the Home Office every 2 weeks. And because of my experience in Dungavel, I'm always afraid. Every 2 weeks, it's the same ritual. Hoping and praying that today, when I go and report, I'm not going to be detained and taken back to Dungavel. So that's it. It's a system that just keeps you helpless, hopeless, desperate, and it's I don't know when it's going to end, but for now I just hold on to hope. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very much, Ronnie, and thank you for sharing what feels like and sounds like a very difficult and traumatic experience, not just here in the UK, and recognizing, again, as Julie also mentioned, this, like the issue that people are being re-traumatized through having to go through this system, being made to feel unsafe. The things that really came out for me is just like, as you mentioned, the isolation, but really like how they take away the dignity for a lot of people by having to rely on the Home Office for money, the accommodation, just restricting your rights and your ability to do the things that you need to do to survive in the UK. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Ronnie, and thank you very much. What I hope we can draw upon later on in the discussion is really how you are challenging all these things through your activist hat on. I would also add, let's try and end detention completely, not fix it with a time limit. I think detention in itself adds to that whole idea that migration can and should be criminalized. And I don't think anyone should have to endure that, even if it's for 28 days. Last but not least, I'm going to come on to Claire. Apologies, but Angelina wasn't able to speak tonight. So we're going to end with our final speaker, Clare Moseley, who's the founder of Care for Calais. Thank you for joining us. And she's going to focus on the current situation, which obviously has been very much covered in the press in terms of how the far right have now basically started to attack hotels. We've had that very visible kind of confrontation in Moseley. And she's also going to touch upon, if she can, kind of what the view has been from refugees who are stranded in Calais about the new UK-France deal. So I'm going to hand over to you, Claire. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that many of us would agree that the government's rhetoric about refugees has inflamed public feeling and empowered the far right. After years of the government describing refugees as illegal immigrants, we have been told that our country is being invaded, that 100 million people are headed here, that there are waves of illegal migrants breaching our borders, and that refugees are in the same class as foreign rapists or murderers. It's created an environment that is not just hostile, but hateful. And it's in that environment of hate that I found myself on the 10th of February outside a hotel in Moseley on Merseyside, where a riot was instigated that was designed to terrify the asylum seekers inside the hotel. What I saw was a police van being set on fire that then exploded. There was fighting all around me with police officers. We could hear breaking glass, rocks being thrown, shouting. And this went on for a number of hours. We were trapped in a car park, surrounded on all sides. This was frightening enough for us, but I hate to think of the fear felt by the people inside the hotel. It's not what I ever expected to see in my hometown. I think of Liverpool as a diverse and welcoming place. I don't think anybody expected to see that in Liverpool. And since then, that intimidation has continued on a daily basis outside that hotel. The people living there can't leave without being harassed. Every Friday night, people gather outside to shout at them. I'm aware of at least 3 subsequent attacks on the asylum seekers when they leave to go to medical and similar appointments. One man was so badly beaten up that he's required hospital treatment. We work in over 200 asylum hotels across the UK, and we know the fear that these attacks are putting on asylum seekers living in the hotels. And I think they're just so cowardly. Because when you're in a country without papers, it's very hard for you to defend yourself. So the perpetrators are picking on people who can't fight back, and the effects are devastating. Last week in a different hotel in Liverpool, a young man hung himself in his hotel room. And this rhetoric has an even more sinister purpose, because the talk of invasion and the threats frighten the public, making it easier to dupe them into allowing this draconian legislation in the new illegal migration bill. The bill's going to strip thousands of refugees of their most basic rights, imposing mandatory detention and forced deportation. And I'm really worried about the detention aspect, because if we can't go in to see people and tell people what's happening to them, nobody's going to know how they're going to be being treated. We're not going to be able to get them access to medical treatment or to lawyers. We're not going to be able to see just what's happening to them. So the detention aspect really frightens me, as well as the fact that it's going to end our history of giving sanctuary to refugees. Public's been told that small boats crossing the channel are one of the 5 greatest issues facing our country. But I think this is nonsense. Last year, we gave 230,000 visas to people from Ukraine and 150,000 to people from Hong Kong. So 50, 60,000 crossing in small boats is not a crisis. But more importantly, if Rishi Sunak truly wanted to stop the boats, there's a far more effective way of doing it. If we gave safe passage to refugees in Calais, we could transfer them to the UK safely and assess their asylum claims here. That would put people smugglers out of business overnight. It is as simple as that. All we would need to do is a short online assessment to work out who has a viable claim and issue an online paper that would act as a visa for safe transfer to the UK. Every moment that we waste on these so-called deterrent plans that don't work risks more innocent lives being lost as people drown in the horribly cold waters of the English Channel. And that scares me, because when 8 people drowned last December, the media coverage was so much less than when the 32 people drowned the year before. And I'm frightened that next time somebody drowns in the Channel, it might just be treated as just another migrant drowning. And we might end up with the Channel being a graveyard, just like the Mediterranean. We've used a safe passage policy before. We introduced it for Ukrainians last year, and there's nothing to stop us introducing one for other refugees now. We don't even need agreement from the French. If the government chose to do it, we could have e-visas working within just 2 weeks. So the question is why, when there's a far more effective and more humane alternative, will the government not consider a policy of safe passage? Why do they persist with brutal plans to bar almost all refugees from seeking asylum here? Could it be with an election looming, they prefer to have the optics of an asylum blog and the language of invasion to enrage their increasingly disenchanted base? Working with PCS Union, we put together a policy proposal for safe passage for refugees in Calais. But that proposal is a dangerous thing, because it exposes the core of the government's re-election policy for what it is: flawed logic designed to exploit the politics of fear. In January, we put this proposal to the Home Affairs Select Committee. Sitting with them behind closed doors, they listened and they could not come up with single rational reason for not implementing it. But rather than consider backing it, immediately following that discussion, Lee Anderson took to Twitter to tell his followers that Care for Calais are as bad as people smugglers and that we are complicit in the people smuggling trade. Those allegations were then repeated in the Daily Mail and then the Telegraph and then on GB News. And since then, the charity, myself and our volunteers have received multiple threats of physical violence. The Home Affairs Select Committee wrote to us to ask whether we act as pull factors for migrants or whether we encourage people to make the dangerous journey to the UK. So I continue to think the safe passage policy is a dangerous thing because it's a rational, proportionate and humane way to stop the boats, to save lives and to help refugees. So we're going to carry on campaigning for safe passage because it's the right thing to do. And I hope what I've said won't put you off from joining us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. And yes, and thank you also for literally being on the front line in solidarity with those refugees that are in the hotels as well. I think you're absolutely right to start it off with the language, invasion, quote unquote, illegal immigrants. Yeah, I think this is underlying it is the racism, which I think, Graham alluded to, but I mentioned the racism that's in the system and obviously has also possibly driven why we have safe routes for certain nationalities and not for others. And yeah, hopefully we can get safe routes for everyone, as we continue to campaign. So I'd like to, if it's okay, we're going to try and extend it until 8:45, so we have a bit more that time for discussion. We've got a couple of questions in the chat already, so I'm going to just read those out and then ask the panelists to share their comments. So there's a question for Ronnie and for others who'd like to respond from Clare. She's conducting research, doctorate in psychology next year on the asylum process and its impact on mental health. And they would like to explore in particular how disempowerment is baked into the system and how it affects people going through it. And so she'd just be interested in hearing thoughts about the relevance, I guess, of the research itself. Clare, again, please do speak up if you'd like to kind of elaborate on that point, or if or come back onto that. Otherwise, I'm going to ask Ronnie if you would like to respond, if you've got thoughts on it, and then Claire, and then Julia. Because Graham unfortunately has to leave.
Yeah. Well, yeah. Mental health is the degradation of mental health is a big issue amongst people seeking asylum. I myself, I had to medicate between 2020 till 2021, and then I found coping mechanisms in self-help groups around the area where I live in the east end of Glasgow. It's because of the isolation. It's because of just the helplessness. So yeah, this is it's commonplace, and I really don't know what to say about it, because it's going to happen. It will continue to happen unless the system changes.
Brilliant, thank you. Claire and Julia.
So I couldn't agree more with what Ronnie just said. I think it's an incredibly relevant topic, because everything that Ronnie in particular has said tonight about the kind of structural violence which is inflicted on people by this system, which leaves people for years on end with their fate entirely in the hands of a faceless institution that won't talk to them, living on sub-poverty wages in degrading conditions. It's a system made of kind of structural violence. What is mind-boggling to me, I think, is that as a matter of public policy, and let's be really clear. I mean, this is how the government is framing its own legislation. As a matter of public policy, government is coming out with legislation. Their thread what they keep on saying about this new bill, and indeed about the old one, is that there's a thread of deterrent running through it. This is legislation which is the last act was, and this is even more so, which is designed to punish. It's designed to make people suffer, because how else would this idea of deterrence, for which, as far as I can see, there's absolutely zero evidence to support, at least not, you know, even by its own logic. It's just it's staggering. So I think that sort of research is incredibly useful, because we all need to push for a world where the system is not being designed to inflict suffering, and enough of us need to act on in the knowledge that that is not what public policy should be about, in any way, shape or form. I think that's what I'd say about that.
Thank you. Claire, did you want to add anything? Or
unfortunately, we're last couple of years seeing the harsh, detrimental mental health impacts of the way the asylum accommodation system affects people going through it. And it's horrible. It's horrible seeing people who have survived traumatic events in their home countries and overcome incredible journeys, and then committed suicide in our country because of what our system has done to them. And we've seen a lot of that. There was a Freedom of Information request about the number of suicides in asylum accommodation. That is absolutely devastating. I don't have words for it. When you're talking about people who are by definition resilient and have overcome and have made incredible journeys to get to the UK from places that are thousands of miles away, that those people should break here is to our everlasting shame. And on the deterrent point, there was some research done that said that refugees do not know about the legal systems of the countries that they're going to. What is in their minds is the things that they are escaping from and the danger that their loved ones are still in back at home and the trauma that they've gone through. And there's no space in their head to be thinking about the legal systems of the countries that they're coming to, and that kind of level of detail. So how can something work as a deterrent if they don't know about it? And just a very simple example that backs that up is that when one of the things that we had to do when the government first launched the Rwanda policy, the first iteration of it, they were taking people straight off the boats in Calais, straight to detention. So we had to have a big exercise to leaflet everybody in Calais, because the only way we could get them legal representation was to make sure they had a lawyer's phone number before they got on a boat. So we had a big exercise to leaflet everybody in Calais just to give them a phone number, because it was such a risk that they wouldn't have access to legal representation because they were going straight from a boat to a detention centre. And like a lot of those people hadn't actually heard about Rwanda. And that's one of the most high profile things ever. I mean, that was in the news everywhere. And there was still a lot of people who hadn't heard of it. So how can a deterrent work if people don't even know about it? And that's on top of the evidence that deterrents, in fact, don't work anyway. It's just, yeah, it's just so, if the government actually spent some time looking at what drives refugee behaviour, they might have a chance of doing something that managed it correctly. But that's not what they're trying to do, is it? That's not what they're trying to do.
No, thank you. And on that point, it might be good to hear your thoughts. Someone's asked it kind of the speaker's thoughts about what's led to such polarized thinking about asylum seekers and refugees. And I know you've touched upon it a bit, Claire, in your talk about the language that's been used, but I wonder if you could kind of elaborate on that, and then I'll come to then Julia and then Ronnie.
Are you asking me about the polarized thinking?
Yes, please. Sorry, I don't know if you can hear me. Can other people hear me?
I personally believe it is deliberate. I believe that our government has done it deliberately for political ends. They have had a long sustained, very well managed and incredibly well produced comms campaign that is centered around one or two messages, the core one of which is that refugees are illegal immigrants, which is an incredibly strong message, because as soon as you use the word illegal, you have associations of criminality, which means you have done something wrong, which means it is your fault, which means it is okay if we treat you as less, or if we remove your rights or don't treat you well, it is okay because you have done something wrong, because you are a criminal. So those words, illegal, they have been hammered home in every single government press release for at least 4 or 5 years. And we have had a minister for it. They run through all government comms, and it is completely deliberate. And that is what they have done for political reasons only. They have demonized a group of the most vulnerable people who cannot fight back because they do not have a voice. They don't speak the language. They're not in control of the situation. They have literally picked the most vulnerable group and done this to them deliberately for political ends. And that is what I believe.
Thank you, Claire. I would say that they're made vulnerable. People are made vulnerable by our systems as well. They may come with some agency and some ability to speak and have the voice, but they're very deliberately kind of like almost like hacked down by our governments and our systems, for sure. Ronnie, can I get your thoughts on this?
No,
I didn't.
Sorry,
Can you
Ronnie,
hear me?
go for it.
Right,
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Right. I'll just echo exactly what Claire said. This is definitely a government decision. It's deliberate, and obviously tying in with Brexit, this has helped it along. All those things, and people have, I don't know, the government has moved more to the right, and it fits their agenda, and it seems to be working. I mean, someone is telling them that it's working, and they're sticking with it, and it's getting through to some people, and it's just so very sad.
Yeah, I was just going to come to Julia, but I would say, like, you know, we've had decades of this. This has come up under Labour back in, goodness knows, 20-something, 2000 and something. And then it's been like, you know, decades of talking about the idea of people being illegal under Theresa May, and how we've got these hostile environment policies, the Immigration Act of 2014 and 2016, deliberate acts to really cement and embed in that we might have people that don't have the right to be in the UK here, and to focus on the legality. And I think Claire's point around, yes, people who the association with criminality and fault, and therefore it's okay to remove your rights. I think it's really, really important. But I feel like it, like you said, it's a very cleverly strategized, manufactured route to get to this point, sadly. So Julie, sorry, do you have anything to add?
I don't really. I think it's all been said. I don't have much more to add. I think it's, thankfully, I'm not a politician. Like, as in, I'm not. I suppose I find it difficult to put my brain where theirs must be. But it strikes me that there are, if people want to talk, if I was a politician and I was looking at the state of things, and there may be many things going on at the moment in this country which could more legitimately be called a crisis than what is happening in terms of the kind of rhetoric that's coming out about people seeking asylum. There's an awful lot going on, isn't there? And yet this is what is being this is what a lot of noise is being made about. So I don't pretend to understand, but like honestly, I don't think I've got anything to add to what's been said by others. I agree.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so there is so just going back onto that, Joe, did you want to share your comment? And again, if anyone wants to actually speak and say share their question directly, please put your hand up and we can come to you, unmute you and have you speak yourself, or if you did want to make again brief comments, just so in terms of time's sake. Joe, and then Monica.
Hi, thanks so much for the presentations today. And thank you all for attending with our full start earlier. My question was really about thinking, Julia, you were talking about it in terms of the sites that are being chosen for containment, and this idea, which I think, you know, is certainly one of the things is around, like, if they were able to get this awful bill through, like, where would people be put? And one of the things that I was just reflecting on actually as I was going to Dungavel this morning was about you know, containment on MOD, on Ministry of Defence land, and then you actually have so little oversight and accountability, and how do you what sort of things do you think that we can do as the public, or how can we have accountability and oversight if these sort of mass detention sites happen on sort of government land?
Shall I respond? Well, it's going to be very it's going to be very difficult. I mean, that's the nature of, if they succeed in, if the plan is to build large-scale detention facilities on massive sites where they can get a couple of thousand people, and if those sites turn out to be detention sites, then they are going to be, I think, incredibly difficult, as difficult as in the rest of the immigration detention estate, if you like, in respect to proper public accountability and scrutiny. And so I think this is where we are at the moment, and this is where we have to mobilise at the moment. The stuff that's in that bill, I'm not a like total expert on the stuff that's in that bill. There's loads in it, and I think people are still trying to get their heads around it. But I think I'm not wrong in saying that it says, I think this might have been mentioned before, along with the kind of massive expansion of detention that's proposed, there's also a kind of clause in there, I think, that talks about the kind of places that people can be detained, and gives the Secretary of State an enormous amount of discretion as to where could be a place of detention. We know that the government not only has been talking about Ministry of Defence sites, we're hearing reports now about Ministry of Defence sites, but the government has also, previously to this bill coming out, been talking about things like rundown holiday camps, student accommodation, and so on and so forth. Well, I think it's beholden on us all, really, to be vigilant, active in our communities in respect of knowing what's going on in terms of any kind of large scale plans for asylum accommodation / detention now, kind of any large sites in our communities. I think what we have seen before and are likely to see again in places where large scale facilities, for example, on MOD land, are being proposed, is real mobilisation in the communities where that is happening, against that happening. And I think it's on us to support those campaigners in respect of, especially in respect of kind of messaging about and talking to people about why this is the wrong solution. So I think it's on all of us basically to get out into our communities, because now this could happen anywhere. Get out into our communities and talk to people in our communities about this issue and about why people should be housed in our communities and not in large scale camps, and support those people mobilising in their communities who are communities where this is happening and who are against it happening on the grounds that it's inhumane, wrong, immoral, and just no way to treat people. Yeah, sorry, that was a lot of talking. I don't know if I made sense.
Ronnie and Claire, if you had anything to add, please jump in. Otherwise, we can also move on to another question. Whatever you feel.
I have nothing further to add on that one.
Just on the Crown Land point, I also wanted to point out to people, if that's all right, sorry to jump in again, that in the current Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill, so this is a completely different bill that's going through Parliament, but in that bill, there are clauses which, there's a clause in there which, if it stays in the bill, will remove obligations that are there to consult local communities about developments on Crown land in England. So that will only apply to England, but it will effectively make it a lot easier for the Secretary of State to make decisions about what happens on Crown land in England.
Yeah, thank you for that point. I think that's something that is being discussed with the human rights groups at the moment. I think you've written a briefing with the Helen Bamber Foundation and Medical Justice. If there's a link to it, that would be great, Julie, if you could post that in the chat as well. I think it's a really important, interesting point that it's again being put somewhere else, so that, you know, it's not, so I guess we forget, we don't see it, we don't think it's going to affect our sector or the people that we're supporting, but yeah, being able to speak it to like a backdoor. Claire's made the point, obviously she's mentioned it in the chat again, around how in terms of Joe's point, that we are going to essentially end up with worse mass accommodation, and we've seen that already with Manson and what happens where there's no scrutiny, there's no access, and then obviously the tragedy that occurs. So if it's okay, I'm going to come to Monica, and then I'm going to read out Alison's question as well.
Yes, hello, my name is, can you hear me? So I'm Monica. I am a pediatric trainee in the northeast of England in Newcastle, and I'm a ex-MSFer. I worked for MSF for a period over 10 years. So I just wanted to touch on something we haven't talked about, and it's the children and the impact on children. So in the northeast, we're having, according to latest reports, we're having like the most refugees and asylum seekers per head of population. So of course we don't have as much population, but a lot of them are being transferred to the northeast. As Graham said, they're trying to send them as far away, and also in places where accommodation is cheaper. And I just recently worked in a hospital in Gateshead, which is one of the areas where they are sending a lot of them. And a clinic has been set up, a refugee clinic in the pediatric hospital. And we saw a lot of them. And we're doing some research, giving them strength difficulties questionnaires to the families and the impact the children have in their mental health. And it's not about the adverse experiences that they have experienced during their travels, but, you know, once they are here. And we see a lot of relationship. There is some research from Australia that those children that were with their families put in detention camps in Christmas Island, were at much more risk of mental health problems, and then less able to cope with, you know, the whole process. And we're seeing the same here for those who are provided a lot of movement within England. And not only the ones that are with the families, but we were also seeing the unaccompanied asylum seeker children who were put in very poor accommodation also in the Northeast by themselves, even though being minors. And as Graham was saying, you know, where is the safeguarding, not just for the adults, but for these children who are still children. And as Ronnie said, you know, you see some of them already experiencing suicidal thoughts and saying, you know, I don't want to be here. And they are put in accommodation where actually, you know, there are very poor areas when they are exposed to racism, and also people using alcohol and drugs that for some of these people they have never seen. They come from little villages in Afghanistan or in Iran, and it's quite scary. They feel they cannot leave their house. So just to touch on the impact that has on children, and how important it is to think about them, because these families come with children sometimes.
Thank you very much, Monica. That's a really important point, and again has been a really live issue, especially with the missing children from Brighton, and how the Home Office is taking parental control over those unaccompanied children specifically, which is incredibly worrying and problematic in terms of, well, the fact that they can't safeguard them at the moment, how there's no way they're going to do it in the future. So I really appreciate your point around children being a very important factor in this. Again, what will the impact be later on down the line as well as they go into adulthood? It's really important. Thank you. If it's okay, I'm just going to, I mean, if there's any reflections from the speakers, please do share. What I wanted to do was really kind of, hopefully with Alison's question, it's kind of a nice wrap-up question. Hopefully one where we can go away with some hope, because it does feel quite depressing at the moment in terms of the way that everything is being attacked. So Alison's asked, you know, what safer collaboration between organisations and agencies who care about the state of affairs can we do that will actually effectively, successfully move the dial significantly back in a humane direction? So, you know, could you give us some hope around what we can do going forward? I'd like to add, I think we need to scrap it all and start again. It doesn't need transformation, it needs overhauling completely. Like, let's just get rid of it. But I'd love to hear from the speakers of ideas that you have. And sorry if we are going to have to wrap it up after that. So apologies if you haven't been able to ask a question or make a comment. Claire, would you like to go first?
So we will be proposing the bill to put in laws asking for safe passage. Because the safe passage policy really exposes the fundamental flaws in this policy, because everything that they say does not make sense. If they wanted to stop the boats, if they wanted to tackle people smuggling, then there is a much more effective way to do it. There is an effective and a humane way. And if we can get people talking about that, it exposes the lies. So that is why we feel we have to take that route. I feel like there is a risk if you go down a route of just saying we need to increase the numbers with resettlement schemes, then they can make a sort of a vague commitment to resettle 5,000 more people in 10 years. And then they can say, oh yeah, we're bringing this in, but we're bringing more safe and legal routes, and that is not enough. If we can get people talking about a real safe passage policy, then it really exposes the flaws in their arguments. And we need to do that because there are massive flaws in their arguments. You know, this deterrents do not work. This will not work. It won't achieve anything, as well as being incredibly inhumane. There are more effective and more humane ways. So let's get people talking about it. That is our plan.
So, thank you. So please look out for Calais kind of amendment, back that where you can, or champion it with your local MPs. Julia, and then I'm going to let Ronnie have the final say.
So just very briefly, you know, I think it's absolutely vital and will be absolutely vital that the right to seek asylum, as in the Geneva Convention for Refugees, is preserved in this country. And like, that's just what we've got to do. Things that I take hope from in respect of that. One is that there are loads of people coming together to work, you know, to fight this stuff in the short term and in the longer term. I think politically, and it would not surprise me in the slightest, I mean, that if many people on the government's own benches were not comfortable, I think we'll probably see that as the bill go through Parliament. I think we've already had an inkling of it in as it was introduced to Parliament, and in some of the abstentions that happened in the vote as it was first introduced. Political parties are quite broad churches. And
Oh, has Julia just frozen?
potentially unlawful. There's a lot in it in respect of compatibility with the European Convention of Human Rights and so on and so forth. This is going to be for the long haul, and things do change, and the sun does kind of come up again. We're in dark times, if you like, but the sun does come up again, and like basically we've got to hang on. In the meantime, I would say really important to mobilise in our local communities. We've got some resources out there somewhere about working with local authorities and councils to mobilise against this anti-refugee legislation. Get out there and mobilise against it, talk to people and change the narrative.
Right, again, Claire has just said it all there. Mobilise, take action. Activism works. It's a very, very powerful tool. So, because I know there are lots of people, many people that are on our side. But when you hear the Home Secretary speaking and she talks about the majority of the British people, she's always so convinced, and so people begin to believe that. But there's so many people that are not sort of like that don't agree with what she says. So we need to mobilize, take action, be active, and change the narrative.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. Totally agree. Change the narrative and create new ones. That's what we need to do. We need to create and take control of those narratives. So if it's okay, I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to all the attendees and to everyone who participated as well, and those who listened. I just want to draw your attention to a Take Action group sheet, which has lists of campaigns and things that you can get involved with. Joe put that in the chat link, so please do have a look at that. There's going to be lots of useful links and documents in there. And again, I think we'll say good night and thank you again to everyone.
Thank you very much. It was really interesting and really appreciated everybody's time. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.
Good night.
Right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.